Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at something fundamental, something core to American identity, the U.S. Constitution. But here's the twist. Its adoption was anything but certain.
That's right. It really hung by a thread. We think of it as this solid foundation, but back then, it was just a proposal. Signed September 17, 1787, sure, but that was just the start.
Just a proposal. So the real drama came afterwards.
Oh, absolutely. The framers knew the document itself wasn't enough. As they put it, the people themselves still had to accept this new constitution. That meant state ratifying conventions.
And the people could actually say no.
They absolutely could. They were free to say yes or no, and honestly, they almost said no.
Wow. Which states were the nail-biters?
Well, the big ones were really close. Think Massachusetts, Virginia, New York. In those key states, just a few shifted votes could have completely derailed the whole project. The whole thing could have collapsed right there.
So how did the Federalists, the ones pushing for it, pull it off? Was it just luck?
Luck played a part, yeah, but it was more than that. It was really down to the brilliance of their new constitution, the sheer force of their political and constitutional arguments, and crucially, their willingness to compromise.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then, to unpack that original thinking, the arguments, the compromises.
Exactly. And then pivot to today, ask the big question, is this system, the one they envisioned, actually working as intended now in 2025? We'll be digging into historical documents, from the National Constitution Center, the National Archives.
And looking at what scholars and commentators are saying right now?
Precisely. Comparing the then and the now. So let's start at the beginning. Why did they even need a new constitution? What was wrong with the old system?
The Articles of Confederation.
Yeah, the Articles. In force in 1781, James Madison famously called them woefully inadequate. And he wasn't wrong. It was basically just a league of friendship between 13 independent states.
Not really a unified country.
Not at all. The central government under the Articles was incredibly weak. It couldn't effectively regulate commerce between the states. It had no power to tax citizens directly.
No power to tax. How did they fund anything? Like the war effort?
That was a huge problem.
Oh.
They struggled constantly. They also had very little power to settle quarrels between states, which you can imagine happened all the time.
And this had real-world consequences for people.
Oh, definitely. We're talking a depleted treasury, states printing their own paper money, which led to it flooding the country and causing extraordinary inflation.
Like, how bad?
Get this. At one point, a pound of tea could cost you $100.
$100 for tea. Okay, that's chaos.
It was. And it wasn't just economic. This instability fueled things like Shays Rebellion in 1786. You had armed farmers literally shutting down courts.
That must have terrified the establishment.
It did. It confirmed their deepest fears that maybe anarchy was just around the corner, that things were falling apart.
So the Federalists saw this and thought, okay, we need something much stronger.
Exactly. They concluded America desperately needed a national government with enough power to address genuinely national issues. Something more like the established governments in Europe, but, American.
But getting there meant a huge fight, right? The Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. Can you break down who was who?
Sure. So the Federalists, they were the ones for the new Constitution, arguing for that stronger national government. Your key players there were Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay.
The authors of the Federalist Papers.
That's them, writing under the name Publius. Hamilton wrote the most, 51 essays, often focusing on the practical structures like the presidency, the courts. Madison wrote 29, often tackling the bigger sort of theoretical underpinnings. Jay chipped in with 5.
And the opposition, the Anti-Federalists.
They were against ratifying the Constitution as it was written. Their vision was rooted in maintaining powerful states. They were much less centralized, but had powerful writers, too, using pen names like Brutus, probably Robert Yates, a Colombian patriot who we think was Mercy Otis Warren, and others like Federal Farmer and Sentinel.
What was their main fear?
At its core, it was a fight over political power and where to place it. It boiled down to federalism. They were deeply afraid this new, powerful national government would just seize all political power.
But that would just absorb the states.
Exactly, that it would swallow up the states the governments people actually felt connected to and eventually abuse the rights of the American people. They genuinely feared it would lead straight back to tyranny, like they'd just escaped with Britain.
And you have to remember, travel was limited then.
Totally. Most Americans rarely traveled outside of their own towns. So a distant capital city, whether it was Philly or New York.
Might as well have been in London.
Right.
Yeah.
They didn't want another remote, out-of-touch government telling them what to do. So the Federalists had a huge task convincing people. How did they make the case for this stronger central government, especially against those fears?
Madison's arguments seem key here, particularly Federalist number 10.
Absolutely crucial. He tackles the problem of factions. These groups driven by passion and self-interest, not the common good. He argued the real danger wasn't in a big nation, but in small republics, like the individual states.
Why small ones?
Because in a smaller area, it's much easier for a majority faction, maybe 51% of the people, to get together, recognize their shared interest, and then just steamroll the rights of the minority.
Okay, so what was Madison's solution? It sounds counterintuitive.
It really was, for the time. His answer wasn't to eliminate factions. He thought that was impossible without destroying liberty, but to control their effects. His solution, an extended sphere, a large republic.
Make the country bigger.
Exactly. In a large republic like the proposed United States, you'd have a much greater variety of parties and interests. So many different groups with so many different agendas that it becomes less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens.
Interesting. So diversity becomes a strength, a protection.
That was the idea. Plus, he argued, a larger republic would be more likely to elect the best and the brightest leaders to national office, people with broader perspectives, leading to more reasoned debate and hopefully better public debates and decisions.
Then there's Federalist number 51, the famous checks and balances.
Right. Madison's other masterpiece. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. It's a brilliant and maybe slightly cynical take on human nature.
He basically said people aren't angels, so government needs to account for that.
Pretty much. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Since they're not, you need to structure the government so that the ambitions of people in the government actually keep each other in check.
So separate the powers, legislative, executive, judicial.
Yes, and then give each branch specific ways to check the power of the others. The president can veto laws from Congress. Congress controls the money. The judiciary can review laws.
So it harnesses politicians' own desire for power to actually control the government.
That's the theory. It's designed to make it hard for any one person or group to take over. The goal was a government more powerful than one created by the Articles of Confederation, but also one of limited powers.
Designed deliberately to be a bit slow and clunky, even.
You could say that, to slow the political process down, filter public opinion, and lead to good decision-making. Prevent rash, passionate decisions.
Okay, but the Anti-Federalists weren't buying the big republic idea, were they? What was their counter?
No, they weren't. Brutus, in his essay number 1, directly attacked it. He argued history proved Republican governments couldn't succeed in a large nation like America.
Why?
He pointed to history. Ancient Rome, Greece, arguing republics were fragile and inevitably collapsed once they got too big. For a republic to work, Brutus argued, the people needed to share similar manners, sentiments, and interests.
Which just wasn't possible in a country as diverse and spread out as the U.S. even then.
Right. He predicted it would just lead to constant clashing interests and factions, making stable governance impossible. He saw a deadlock and conflict, not reasoned debate.
Did the Anti-Federalists have their own plan, though? A replacement for the Articles?
That was a major weakness. They largely didn't offer a concrete alternative. They were mainly critiquing the Federalist plan. This made it easier for the Federalists to frame the choice simply as our new Constitution or the deeply flawed Articles of Confederation.
So the debate raged. You mentioned state conventions. How democratic was that process?
Well, for its time. Surprisingly so. In most states, nearly all taxpaying male citizens could vote for delegates to these ratifying conventions. And the debate wasn't just in the halls, it was everywhere. Newspapers, pamphlets at bars and taverns.
Sounds intense, like the whole country was arguing about it.
It really was. And compromise became absolutely key to getting it ratified. The Massachusetts Compromise was huge.
What was that?
Massachusetts agreed to ratify, but strongly recommended a series of amendments be added afterwards. This set a precedent. Other states followed suit.
And that led directly to the Bill of Rights.
Exactly. Ratified in 1791. Adding those first 10 amendments calmed a lot of the Anti-Federalist fears about protecting individual liberties. It addressed one of their biggest objections.
Who is pushing hardest for that Bill of Rights?
George Mason was a very influential voice. His objections to the Constitution really hammered the lack of a Bill of Rights. He, like many Anti-Federalists, worried the Constitution's broad powers could lead to abuses, new crimes, cruel and unusual punishments, and seizure of new political power.
But even with the promise of amendments, it was still about popular acceptance, right?
Absolutely. Madison himself stressed this in Federalist No. 40. He argued for popular sovereignty, saying the Constitution was basically just paper on which it was written unless the people ratified it.
It wasn't up to the famous founders?
No, not Washington, not Franklin. It was we the people. James Wilson made this point powerfully, too, in 1788, asking, essentially, were these constitutions made by the people's delegates, and then were they submitted to the people for approval? That idea was revolutionary.
And it really was close, right to the end.
Unbelievably close. North Carolina and Rhode Island didn't even ratify until after George Washington had already become president and the new government was up and running.
Wow. That really underscores the uncertainty. Okay, so that's how it squeaked through then. Let's jump forward. How's this 230-something-year-old framework holding up now?
Well, it's lasted. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor called it the world's shortest and oldest national constitution. She praised its balance, neither so rigid as to be stifling nor so malleable as to be devoid of meaning, and putting governance in the hands of the people was truly radical.
But there's always a but, isn't there? We hear a lot today about gridlock, polarization, even talk of a constitutional crisis.
We do, and critics argue the system is now badly out of step with democratic practice. Some even call it sclerotic, like it's hardened and can't adapt.
What are the specific complaints? What parts are seen as, well, undemocratic or broken?
Several things come up frequently. The malapportionment of the Senate is a big one. Wyoming has the same number of senators as California, despite the massive population difference.
So a vote in Wyoming carries way more weight than a vote in California.
Massively more. Then there are lifetime terms for Supreme Court justices appointed decades ago and potentially out of step with current societal views, and the amendment process itself.
It's incredibly difficult.
Extremely. The last really substantive amendment was, the 26th, lowering the voting age. That was back in 1971, nearly half a century ago now. Oh, actually, I misspoke. Nearly a century is incorrect. It was 1971.
And the Electoral College is always controversial.
Always. Because it allows for electing presidents who do not win the majority or even plurality of votes. That's happened 5 times now. People also point to gerrymandering and single-member congressional districts as things distorting representation.
What about the branches themselves? Let's start with the judiciary. Harrison thought it would be the least dangerous branch.
Right, the guardian of the Constitution, as he put it in Federalist No. 78. And Marbury v. Madison in 1803 established judicial review, making the Supreme Court the ultimate interpreter.
But is it still seen as just an interpreter? There's debate about judicial activism.
Huge debate. Judicial activism versus judicial restraint.
Yeah.
Critics say activism means judges are basically making law based on their own views, overstepping their authority, rather than just applying the text or original intent.
What's the court's real role supposed to be in protecting democracy?
That's a great question. Professor Jessica Silby at BU Law has a really interesting take. She says, the courts have never, ever been the branch of government that saves democracy. Ever.
Really? Not their job.
Her argument is their job is to uphold the rule of law, constitutional principles of separation of power and individual rights so that democracy can work. They provide the framework, the guardrails, but they don't drive the car.
Okay, what about the executive? Presidential power seems to be constantly pushing boundaries.
We've certainly seen examples recently where presidents, arguably from both parties at different times, take actions that push the limits or seem to exceed them altogether. Things like trying to change birthright citizenship via executive order, freezing congressionally appropriated funds, attempting to shut down agencies.
And the courts sometimes step in.
Yes, we've seen courts block actions, with judges sometimes using very strong language, calling them blatantly unconstitutional.
So when does that become a crisis?
Professor Silby argues, when people elected to uphold the rule of law and to follow the Constitution openly defy the plain meaning of laws, then yes, we're in a constitutional crisis. It's about respecting the fundamental rules.
But where's Congress in all this? The legislative branch seems less powerful than maybe it was intended to be.
That's a major criticism, that Congress has abdicated much of its power of the purse, letting unelected officials in the executive branch make key spending decisions. And the fact they haven't passed a proper budget in, 27 years? That's pretty striking.
Relying on stopgap measures instead. And what if a president just ignored the Supreme Court? Could that happen?
It's a nightmare scenario for constitutional scholars.
Yeah.
There are historical whispers of it, like Andrew Jackson supposedly saying after a ruling against him, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Whether he actually said it is debated, but the sentiment highlights the reliance on voluntary compliance.
And that original fight over federalism, state versus national power, that's still going strong too.
Oh, absolutely. The states' rights argument has been a constant theme in American history. The nullification crisis, the Civil War, resistance to desegregation, arguments over suffrage. While the Constitution created a stronger federal government, it was still meant to be one of limited powers. Finding that balance remains a central tension.
So with all these issues, what's the solution? Amend the Constitution or start over?
That's the million-dollar question. Some voices argue strongly the U.S. needs a new constitution. They say the current one is too out of step with democratic practice, too sclerotic.
But others push back hard on that.
Very hard. They argue its very age is a testament to the resiliency of the country. They warn that trying to rewrite it now would destroy any institutional value and inevitably become partisan. Given today's polarization in money and politics, they fear we'd end up with a worse document.
The amendment process was designed to be hard, wasn't it? To prevent constant tinkering.
Deliberately difficult, requiring broad consensus from the states, 3/4 of them. The founders wanted stability. But critics say getting 34 of 50 states today for any actual amendment that does much of anything is basically impossible.
Is the problem the document itself, or maybe us, the people running the system or participating in it?
That's another perspective. Some argue human behavior is no different today than when the Constitution was written. The document is fine. The problem, in this view, lies with the political ruling class being influenced by power and money, maybe combined with a public that's largely ignorant or doesn't participate enough.
So a lot to unpack there. We've gone from this incredibly fragile birth through the framers' attempt to build a system that could handle human flaws, right up to today's fierce debates about whether it's still working.
It was a truly radical experiment, wasn't it? Popular sovereignty, limited government, checks and balances, all designed because they knew power corrupts and people pursue self-interest. It was born from compromise and maybe requires ongoing compromise to function.
And while it's proven incredibly durable, you can't ignore the current strains. The polarization, the arguments over interpretation, the questions about whether it meets modern democratic standards.
It's definitely being tested. Which leads to a final thought, perhaps. The framers knew men were not angels.
Yeah.
They specifically designed the system to make ambition counteract ambition, to slow things down, to force deliberation.
So maybe the gridlock and the conflict we see, the stuff that feels like a crisis, maybe that's actually the system working exactly as designed, uncomfortably perhaps, but working to prevent tyranny by making quick, decisive action difficult.
Or have we reached a point where the nature of our politics, the speed of information, the depth of our divisions, have these things pushed us beyond what that 18th century framework can effectively manage? Has the system designed for public reason and principled compromise broken down in the face of modern pressures?
A question with no easy answer. Something for all of us to think about.